Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The clock on the mantelpiece had stopped at 3 minutes past 4. I cannot say how long it had been frozen that way, only that I noticed it one Tuesday afternoon as twilight bled through the windows. And from that moment, it became the axis upon which my existence turned. The hour hand and minute hand, both slender blades of black iron, pointed with terrible accusation just beyond the 4. The second hand trembled mid-arc, suggesting motion so faint it seemed less a measurement of time than a memory of it. I would stare for hours, waiting for the tick that never came. And in that waiting, the entire house seemed to hold its breath with me. Dust motes hung suspended in slanting light, like miniature galaxies. The silence was not absence, but presence, a thick velvet drapery smothering the world. Dawn arrived each morning not with triumphant fanfare, but as a slow gray seepage around heavy drapes, perpetually hesitant to commit to day. My name is Jeremiah Ashford. At that time, I was a creature of surface and light. People told me I was beautiful, and I had learned to wear that beauty not as gift, but birthright, armor polished to blinding sheen. My face was harmony of angles and planes, my eyes the color of summer sky after rain, my hair a cascade of wheat gold waves. I moved through rooms, and they brightened. I spoke, and people leaned closer. It was a form of magic, I suppose. Sorcery of genetics and charm that bent the world to my will. But in the stillness of that inherited house, with the dead clock on the mantel, I began to feel the first cold drafts on a soul I had never before acknowledged possessing. The house was my inheritance, a looming Victorian edifice on the outskirts of a town that had forgotten its own name. It overflowed with relics of my family, a lineage of stern-faced men and pale women who stared from oil paintings with weary disappointment. In the attic, under a dust sheet releasing clouds of ancient, sweet-smelling decay, I found the other painting, my portrait, commissioned by a doting aunt years prior. I had forgotten it entirely. When I pulled away the sheet, breath caught in my throat. It was perfect. It was yet my absolute zenith, captured with luminous, almost cruel fidelity. The artist had rendered the hopeful curve of my mouth, the untroubled clarity in my eyes, the smooth, unblemished skin, seeming to glow from within. It was a lie, a beautiful, frozen lie, because I could feel for the first time tiny invisible cracks beginning to form in my own flesh. A late night of excess would leave shadows under my eyes that took hours to fade. A cruel thought would momentarily twist my lips into something less than handsome. This painting, this perfect, ageless boy, was a mockery of the man I was becoming. It was Darwin Blackwood who gave voice to the corruption already blooming in my heart. He was what I called a friend, a man 20 years my senior with a mind like a polished razor and a soul I now believe was pure void. He visited one evening, swirling brandy and crystal as firelight danced across his sharp, intelligent features. "You look troubled, Jeremiah," he said, voice a low, smooth murmur. "Trouble is a wrinkle on the spirit. One must avoid it at all costs." "It's that," I gestured vaguely toward the mantel. "Than this portrait I found in the attic. It's like a ghost of me. A better, simpler version." Darwin rose and accompanied me to view it. He stood before the painting for a long time, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Ah, but don't you see the genius of it? This canvas can be your scapegoat, your whipping boy. It can bear the burdens you're too precious to carry. You wish to experience life, truly experience its depths. You cannot do that while clinging to this pristine innocence. It's a cage, my boy. He tapped the canvas with a fingernail, producing a soft thud. Indulge yourself, Jeremiah. Taste every forbidden fruit. Let your soul be scoured by experience, while this pretty thing here absorbs the stains. You remain untouched, a spectator to your own decadence. It's the most profound magic of all. His words sank into me like hooks, barbed and deep. They felt like confirmation, a permission slip signed in blood. And so I began. It started small, with petty cruelties that felt like experiments. I strung along the grocer's daughter, a sweet, plain girl named Lily with eyes full of quiet devotion. I drew her in with my charm, made her believe in a future that glimmered just for her, then cast her aside with casually brutal remarks, watching the light in her eyes snuff out like a candle in wind. I did it not for pleasure, but for the experiment of it. Each time I returned home, my heart a cold, hard stone, I would climb to the attic and examine the portrait. At first, I saw nothing. Then one evening, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible tightening around the painted mouth. The smile was still there, but it had acquired a hint of strain, a suggestion of secret knowledge. A thrill, cold and sharp, shot through me. It was working. My loyal friend, Jonathan Hartley, a man of solid morals and a heart too good for this world, saw the change in me. "Jeremiah, what's happening to you?" he asked one autumn day as we walked the grounds, leaves crunching like bones under our feet. "You're different. There's a coldness about you. The way you treat Miss Mills, it's not right." "Right?" I laughed, the sound foreign in my throat. "Right is a word for people afraid to live, Jonathan. I'm merely expanding my horizons." "You're rotten from the inside out," he said, voice low and fierce. "I can smell it on you." I dismissed him naturally. His morality seemed quaint, provincial. I had graduated to grander indulgences, seeking darker pleasures in the city's underbelly, places where money could buy silence and sensations that scraped nerves raw. I surrounded myself with sycophants and degenerates, their hollow laughter echoing through once quiet halls. The air grew thick with stale perfume, expensive tobacco, and something else, something metallic and sour, like old pennies and regret. Through it all, the clock remained frozen, silent witness to my unraveling, and the portrait drank it all in. The changes became pronounced. A faint network of lines webbed the corner of one painted eye. The clear blue of the irises grew muddied, clouded with yellow-gray haze like dirty smog. The skin, once luminous, took on a waxy, sallow tone. Most disturbing was the expression. The hopeful youth was gone, replaced by a sneering, jaded specter. The lips curled in permanent rictus of disdain. It was still me, undeniably, but me as seen through a filter of pure corruption. I stopped receiving visitors. Lily had disappeared from town, her family tight-lipped and grim. Jonathan had given up on me. Only Darwin remained, a constant, smiling presence, his eyes gleaming with avaricious pride as he watched my descent. "Magnificent," he would whisper, standing before the changing portrait. "You're becoming a true original." The horror was no longer in the portrait's transformation, but in my own stasis. I looked in mirrors and saw the same flawless face, the same clear eyes, but I felt ancient. I felt the weight of every sin, every cruelty, not on my skin but on my spirit. I was a young man trapped in a body that refused to show scars while my soul festered and rotted. The disconnection was a form of madness. I would pinch the smooth skin of my cheek and feel nothing, while the painted version in the attic seemed to throb with palpable, diseased life. The final act of my corruption was also the most petty. In a fit of pique, I spread a vicious, fabricated rumor about a local businessman. A lie that ruined his reputation and drove his family to destitution. I did it for no reason other than that I could. That night, I climbed to the attic, drawn by morbid compulsion. I carried no lamp. Moonlight through the grimy circular window was enough. The portrait was hideous. The face was a mask of leering depravity. The eyes were sunken, gleaming with feral cunning. The skin was blotchy and coarse. The lips pulled back from teeth that seemed too long and yellow. A single, inky tear traced a path through the grime on its cheek. And in the background, where once there had been a vague pastoral landscape, I now saw faint, twisted shapes resembling the ruined businessman, his wife, and the weeping figure of Lily, all woven into the scenery like damned souls in a tapestry of hell. I stumbled back, a cry strangling in my throat. This was no longer mere reflection. It was a ledger, a detailed account of my spiritual bankruptcy. And then I heard it. The first sound from the mantelpiece in what felt like a lifetime. Tick. The sound was deafening in the profound silence. Not the gentle talk of a timepiece, but the sound of a hammer striking bone. Tick. I fled the attic, stumbling down narrow stairs into the main hall. The clock on the mantel was moving. The second hand was jerking forward, one agonizing tick at a time. But it was moving backwards. Tick. Not. With each reverse tick, a wave of nausea washed over me. The air grew thick and cold. I could smell the iron tang of blood, the cloying sweetness of decayed flowers, the ozone scent of raw fear. Tick! I looked at my hands. For a fleeting second, I saw them as they were in the portrait, veiny, stained, nails ragged. I blinked, and they were smooth again. The house itself seemed to breathe, walls contracting and expanding with a low, rasping sound. The frozen dawn trapped at the windows was finally breaking, but it was a sickly, greenish light, the color of a bruise. What? I knew what was happening. The bargain was due. The portrait could bear no more. It was returning its burden to the source. I ran to the front door, heart a wild bird beating against my ribs. I fumbled with the lock, slick fingers slipping on cold brass. It would not turn. The windows were similarly sealed, not locked but frozen shut, as if the very air outside had solidified into barrier. I was trapped in the belly of this silent, ticking beast. The clock's sound began to change. The ticks grew faster, merging into a frenzied, chattering rattle, a countdown to 0. I fell to my knees in the center of the hall, hands over my ears. But I could not block it out. It was inside my head. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy, a physical weight pressing down on me. I dared to look up. The clock hands were gone. The face was a blank, black circle. From the attic, I heard a soft tearing sound, like canvas ripping under its own tension. I do not have words for what came down the stairs. It was not the painting, and it was not me. It was something in between. It moved with stiff, jerky grace, its form shifting in the foul light. I saw the leering face of the portrait superimposed over my own reflection in a darkened window. I felt coldness seep into my bones. A final, terrible transfer. It was not taking my life. It was taking my place. The perfect, unchanging vessel was finally being filled with the rotten contents it was designed to hold. The last thing I saw was the front door swinging open of its own accord, revealing the gray, pre-dawn landscape. The thing that was once a painting, now wearing my face and body, walked out into the world. It did not look back. I tried to follow, but my legs would not obey. I was a ghost in my own house. I crawled to the doorway and looked out. The wind was rising, a cold, moaning breath that swept across the fields, picking up dry leaves, dust, forgotten fragments of lives, beginning to scour the earth. A slow, cold rain began to fall, washing color from the world. The darkness under the trees deepened, spilling out like ink. I watched as wind and water and encroaching dark covered every trace. It smoothed the footprints left by the thing wearing my skin. It washed sin from the stones. It swallowed the house, the land, the very memory of my name. There was no sound now, but the elemental sigh of the world erasing itself. And I am here in the threshold, neither in nor out, a whisper trapped in settling dust, waiting for the landscape to swallow me too. The waiting is its own kind of time. I have no need for the clock anymore, for its silence is now my own. I am a draft that cannot stir a curtain, a pressure on a floorboard that does not creak. The house continues its decay around me, but I am no longer its master, merely a fixture, like the smell of damp plaster and forgotten things. Sometimes I see him, or it. From a window, I catch glimpses of a figure walking the overgrown path at the edge of the property. He wears my face, my walk, the very cut of my clothes from the day Darwin first poisoned my ear. He is perfect, unblemished, the golden boy preserved for eternity. He never looks toward the house. He is always leaving, always moving away, and people from town sometimes see him too. They speak in hushed tones of the handsome Mr. Ashford, who became such a recluse but whose fortune seems to grow, whose influence subtly warps the town's affairs, always from a distance. I have learned the geography of my prison. I know which dust motes will dance in specific slivers of afternoon light, though the light no longer warms me. I watch spiders spin their intricate fatal webs in high corners, and I understand their work. I am a web myself, a pattern of memory and regret stretched thin across empty rooms. The world outside continues to forget. Rain falls and washes, wind blows and scatters, and green, indifferent tendrils of ivy climb the walls, seeking to pull stones back into the earth. Lily's family moved away. Jonathan, I heard, took a position in a city across the continent, his good heart finally broken free of this place. Darwin never returned. His experiment was concluded. Today, a man and woman from the city came. They had papers declaring the property derelict to be reclaimed by the bank. They spoke in loud, confident voices that echoed in hollow spaces, their words bouncing off my silence. The man pushed open the front door, the same door that had sealed my fate, and it swung inward with a groan I felt in my teeth. They walked through the halls, their footsteps loud and alien. The woman shivered. "It's freezing in here," she said, rubbing her arms. "And it feels watched. Just old houses," the man replied. But his voice was less certain now. They did not climb to the attic. They saw the blank face of the clock on the mantel, and the man joked that it was as good a time as any to be done with the place. They left quickly, their business concluded. The door left ajar behind them. This is my final punctuation. An open door I cannot pass through. Wind enters now. A slow, steady flow, carrying the scent of wet earth and dying leaves. It moves through the halls, a gentle exhalation that stirs the dust of decades. The dust rises in a soft gray cloud, and it begins to settle upon me. It coats my still form, my sightless eyes, my silent throat. It is a shroud, patiently woven by the house itself. The erosion is nearly complete. The landscape is swallowing me, grain by grain. There is only the wind and the dust and the long, slow fade to gray. The gray is not emptiness. It is substance, a fine silt of oblivion filling the spaces where I used to be. I feel it in what was once my mind, a soft, ceaseless sifting, burying the sharp edges of memory. The face of Lily, the sound of Jonathan's voice, the oily smile of Darwin. They are all becoming smooth, featureless stones at the bottom of a still river. Through the open door, The seasons perform their silent play. I see the green frenzy of summer vines claw at the doorframe, the blaze of autumn leaves skittering across the threshold, the stark white silence of snow building a drift against the jamb. None of it touches me. The dust insulates me, a cocoon of neglect. Then a change, a vibration, subtle at first, a tremor in the foundation. Not the wind, the grind of heavy machinery, the shouts of men. They have come for the house. I hear the brutal smash of a wall giving way, the splintering of old wood. A shaft of raw, unfiltered daylight spears the gloom, illuminating swirling dust in my prison. It is harsh, accusing light. A workman, his face obscured by a mask against the dust, steps into the hall. He is broad and real, his boots crushing plaster littering the floor. He does not see me, of course, but he pauses, and his eyes scan the room, passing over the mantel, the walls, and for a moment, they rest on the space I occupy. He shivers violently, a full-body convulsion that seems to surprise him. "Jack, you feel that?" He calls out to his unseen partner. "This room's like a walk-in freezer." Another voice, distant and muffled, replies, "Just get the last of the fixtures. This place gives me the creeps." The man moves forward, his task clear. He approaches the mantel. He reaches for the clock, his gloved fingers, rough and practical, close around the black, blank face. He pulls it from its perch, and as he does, his gaze drops. He sees the fine layer of dust on the floor where I kneel, a shape that might almost be human, a gentle mound with no footprints leading to or from it. He stares for a second too long, his brow furrowed, not in fear but in superstitious confusion. Then he shakes his head, turns, and carries the clock away into the light. Its removal is the breaking of a final, fragile tether. The last object that witnessed my end is gone. The silence that remains is deeper than before, absolute and terminal. The demolition continues around me. The roof is torn away, and the sky is a vast, indifferent bowl of gray. Walls fall like dying giants. The dust of the house joins my own dust, a great cloud of dissolution. I feel myself coming apart, not with a bang but a sigh. The particles that were held in the vague shape of Jeremiah Ashford are scattered, mixed with plaster, and the memory of paint and pollen of forgotten flowers from the garden. There is no thought left, only a final sensory impression. The taste of dust, the sight of the crumbling doorway, framed against a stand of trees just beginning to bud with new, oblivious spring. And then, nothing. Not a presence, not even a ghost. Just the slow, patient settlement of Earth, reclaiming its own. The final and perfect silence of a story that has been thoroughly, completely erased. The land did not lie fallow for long. New money from the city saw the rolling hills, an old creek, as charming backdrop for something called Whispering Pines Estates. They never found the foundation stones of my house. They plowed them under, along with everything else. Now the land is a grid of manicured lawns and houses that all look the same, painted in cheerful, identical shades. Children play on grass where Jonathan once pleaded with me to see reason. Their bright plastic toys dot the ground where Lily's tears fell. I am not here, and yet a part of me is everywhere. I am the sudden chill that descends on a sun-warmed patio for no reason. I am the flicker of shadow in a basement corner that has no source. I am the faint, sourceless taste of copper that sometimes fills the mouth of a sleeping child, making them whimper and turn over. The new residents are practical people. They blame drafts, faulty wiring, indigestion. But sometimes, one of them will look out a window at night and see a man walking a dog along the newly paved street. He's handsome, impeccably dressed, his face a mask of ageless perfection. He never seems to age, year after year. He does not live in whispering pines, but he is often seen at its edges, a familiar stranger. He is a trustee for the Land Management Board, a silent partner in the development. His name, on the rare documents that require it, is Jeremiah Ashford. He is always leaving, always just turning a corner, and when you look again, he is gone. And I am the dust that settles on the windowsill after he passes. I am the hollow hum of the refrigerator in the dead of night. I am the quiet, the endless, patient quiet, waiting for the paint on these new houses to crack, for foundations to shift, for the slow and inevitable decay to begin all over again. The story was not erased. It was only waiting for a new page. The new page began with the Miller family. They moved into the corner lot, the one sitting directly over the old cellar. Mark Miller was a cheerful man, a financial advisor who believed in spreadsheets and solid returns. His wife Sarah loved the open floor plan and large windows looking onto their perfect fenced yard. Their daughter Chloe was 8, with a quiet seriousness that other children mistook for shyness. She was the first to notice the draft. It wasn't constant, a ribbon of cold air that would snake through the living room on the warmest summer evenings, coiling around an ankle or brushing the back of a neck. Her parents dismissed it. "Old land," Mark said. "It holds the cold." But Chloe would watch dust motes dancing in sunbeams, seeing them suddenly swirl in frantic, invisible currents. I felt her awareness like a tiny pinprick of light in my diffuse consciousness. She was a sensitive receiver, tuned to a frequency others had forgotten. She began having nightmares, not of monsters, but of a man with a sad, smooth face who stood in a dusty room, and another man, handsome and smiling, who walked away from her down a long road, his footsteps making no sound. She started drawing. Her pictures were filled with 2 figures. One was a gray man, made of scribbled pencil lines, trapped inside a house. The other was a golden man with a perfect empty smile, standing outside under a yellow sun. She never spoke about the drawings, just tucked them away in a box under her bed. The thing that wore my name, the one who walked in the world, must have felt it too. This faint resonance. He began appearing more frequently in whispering pines. He would be there, leaning against his expensive silent car, watching the children play. He always seemed to be looking at Chloe. His expression was the same one from the portrait's final state, a leering, proprietary interest, disguised as benign smile. One afternoon, Sarah was gardening when he approached. He introduced himself as Mr. Ashford, a benefactor of the community. His voice was smooth, hypnotic. "You have a lovely daughter," he said. "Such a bright, perceptive child. She has an old soul." Sarah, flattered, chatted with him. But when she came inside, she had a headache, a throbbing pain behind her eyes that tasted, she told Mark later, like old pennies. That night, the clock in their hallway, a cheap battery-operated thing, began to malfunction. Its digital display flickered, not showing numbers, but a frantic backwards countdown. Mark pulled the batteries out, muttering about factory defects. I tried to warn them. I had no voice, but I had influence on the atmosphere, on small, unaccountable things. I made the pages of Chloe's storybook flutter when she read about trapped princesses. I made the television static into a low, rhythmic ticking sound when a news story about a local business scandal came on. A scandal with Mr. Ashford's fingerprints all over it. The family would shake their heads, change the channel, blame the wiring. The connection between Chloe and the thing in the world was growing stronger. It was a new kind of portrait, a living one. He was the flawless surface, and she was becoming the sensitive canvas upon which truth was being projected. He was drawn to her innocence, a new, clean vessel for the same old poison. I gathered what little of myself remained, the collective dust of my regret, the memory of my own corruption. I was no longer a man, not even a ghost. I was a stain, a negative space. And as Mr. Ashford stood across the street, his gaze fixed on Chloe's window, I poured all of my silent, accumulated weight into a single, focused breath of air. I blew a dead brown leaf from the oak tree in their yard. It skittered across the pavement, directly in front of Mark Miller as he was taking out the trash. It startled him. He looked up, and for the first time, he really saw the man standing in the shadows. He saw the way he was staring at his daughter's window. He saw the smile that did not touch his eyes. A father's instinct, a practical, real-world fear, flared in him. It was a different kind of magic, but it was powerful. He went inside, locked the door, and called the homeowners association to complain about a suspicious loiterer. It was a small thing, a trivial resistance, but it was a beginning. The thing that was me turned and walked away, his perfect face twisted for a moment into a familiar sneer of disdain. The game was not over. It had simply found a new board, new pieces. And I, the dust in the walls of this new house, the chill in the air, the whisper in the wires, am here, waiting, watching. The story was not erased. It had simply learned to write itself in subtler ink. The next day, Mark Miller installed security cameras. Small, black, unblinking eyes that watched the street and the yard. He showed Chloe how they worked on his phone, a little square of live video from her room. She nodded, her small face serious. She understood the need for watchfulness, even if she didn't understand the nature of the thing they were watching for. I felt a shift then, a realignment. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a fortress. And I, the unseen resident, was its first line of defense. My influence was limited to the interior, to the space within the walls. I could cool the air in a specific spot, making Chloe pull her blanket tighter on a warm night. I could dim a light bulb for a fraction of a second when her eyes scanned a page with a particularly important word. I was a collaborator in her subconscious, a silent partner in her growing unease. Mr. Ashford, for his part, adapted. His appearances became more official, more sanitized. He was in the local paper, photographed cutting the ribbon for a new playground he had donated to the community. He stood at the podium, his voice smooth and reassuring over the sound system. But from my vantage, diffused through the very air of the Miller house, I could feel the lie radiating from his image on the television screen. It was a pressure, a low-frequency hum of wrongness that made the family dog, a placid golden retriever, whine and hide in the closet. Chloe saw it too. While her parents clapped politely at the news segment, she looked at the perfect smiling man on the screen and whispered a single word to her empty room. Empty. That word was a key. It was the same word I had thought all those years ago when I first saw the finished portrait. The recognition created a circuit, a fragile bridge between her living soul and my dead echo. For a moment, the dust on her windowsill seemed to hold a shape, the vague outline of a face. She didn't scream. She reached out a single finger and touched it. The dust scattered, but the connection held. The thing in the world felt the bridge form. He concluded his speech and looked directly into the camera, his gaze seeming to pierce through the lens and into the Miller's living room. His smile never wavered, but his eyes were cold, dead stars. They knew I was still here. He knew I had found a way to speak, not with a voice, but with a child's intuition. The battle would not be fought with fists or fury. It would be fought with whispers and warnings, with drafts and nightmares, and the quiet, stubborn resistance of a little girl who saw the gray man in the corner of her eye. He had the world, but I had the house. And the house, for now, had her. The story was writing its next chapter, and for the first time in a long, long time, I was no longer just a spectator. The new playground was a garish splash of primary colors against the green of the hill. It was officially opened the following Saturday, and the whole neighborhood turned out. Mark Miller was there, shaking Mr. Ashford's hand, his earlier suspicion buried under a layer of civic pride and the man's undeniable charm. Sarah chatted with other mothers, laughing. Chloe stood apart near the swings, watching. Mr. Ashford moved through the crowd like a beneficent king, patting children on the head, handing out ice cream vouchers. He was working his way toward her. I could feel his intent. A cold, sharp focus amid the warm chaos of the crowd. He held a single red balloon, its string wrapped around his fingers. He knelt before Chloe, bringing himself to her eye level. His smile was a practiced thing of perfect warmth. "Hello, Chloe," he said, his voice like honey. "This is for you. A small gift for such a thoughtful girl." He held out the balloon. The red rubber shimmered, impossibly bright. Chloe looked at it, then at his eyes. She didn't move. "Go on, take it," her father called from a few feet away, his voice encouraging. I had no power here, outside the walls of the house. I was a wisp, a memory of a chill. I could only watch as her small hand reached out. Her fingers brushed the string, and in that touch, she saw it. A flicker, not in the air, but in her mind. She saw a different hand, pale and long-fingered, dipping a brush into a palette of oily, dark paints. She felt a profound, soul-sick weariness and a greed that was a physical ache. It was my memory, bleeding through the connection he had tried to forge with his gift. She snatched her hand back as if burned. The balloon, released, bobbed away into the sky. Mr. Ashford's smile tightened at the edges. The pleasant mask slipped for a single, terrifying instant, and beneath it was nothing but a vast, hungry void. "I don't like red," Chloe said, her voice small but clear. Mark was at her side in an instant, a protective hand on her shoulder. "Sorry about that, Mr. Ashford. She's just shy." The mask was back, seamless and impenetrable. Of course, no offense taken. He stood, his height suddenly imposing. Children have such unique perspectives. It's what makes them so interesting. He walked away, joining a group of other trustees. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt in Mark's mind, planted when he saw the man loitering, now sprouted. He looked down at his daughter's pale, determined face, and then at the retreating back of the handsome, generous man. The two images did not align. That night, Chloe did not dream of the gray man or the golden man. She dreamed of paint. Thick, cloying, the color of a bruise, covering everything, smothering her. She woke up, gasping, the taste of copper thick in her mouth. Down the hall, in the living room, the security camera feed on Mark's phone flickered. For 3 full seconds, the screen showed not the empty, moonlit room, but the interior of my old study. A dusty room, a shrouded easel, a figure kneeling on the floor. Then it returned to normal. Mark saw it when he got up for a glass of water. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the frozen image on his phone, the one he had screenshot in a surge of disbelief. He didn't wake Sarah. He just poured the water down the sink, untouched, and stared out the window into the dark. He was a practical man. He believed in facts, but the facts were beginning to tell a story he could no longer ignore. The cold spot, the flickering lights, his daughter's nightmares, the loitering, the balloon, and now this, a ghost in his machine. He looked out at the quiet, sleeping houses of whispering pines, and for the first time, he saw not a peaceful community, but a veneer. A fresh coat of paint over something very old and very rotten. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any draft, that the man who called himself Ashford was the one who had applied the brush. The battle was no longer just in the realm of whispers. It had just entered the world of evidence. He did not speak of the screenshot to Sarah, not at first. He sent it to a tech-savvy friend from college with a vague question about digital glitches and image corruption. The friend's reply was swift and unsettling. There was no sign of a hack, no evidence of a superimposed image. The data was clean. The friend joked about a ghost in the machine. Mark did not laugh. His practicality began to curdle into a quiet, focused paranoia. He started a file on his computer, password protected. He saved the screenshot. He noted dates and times. The night of the malfunctioning clock. The afternoon of the red balloon. The specific times Chloe had woken crying. He began researching the history of the land, digging through online county archives with grim determination. He found old survey maps, but the scans were poor. The names faded. The foundation of my house was a blank spot, a secret the earth had kept. Mr. Ashford, sensing the shift, became a ghost in the community. He was seen less often, his public appearances now brief and carefully staged. But his influence was felt in other ways. A week after the playground incident, the Homeowners Association, of which he was the largest financial backer, sent a sternly worded notice to the Millers. Their lawn, the letter stated, was not in compliance with community standards. The grass was a quarter-inch too long. A single gnarled branch from the old oak tree needed to be trimmed back. It was petty, bureaucratic harassment, but it was a message. I am watching you. I control the ground you walk on. I could do little but amplify the unease. When Mark sat at his computer late at night, scrolling through the old maps, I would make the floorboard creak behind him. He would spin around, his face taut, seeing nothing. I was the reason he started drinking his coffee black, because the milk from the fridge sometimes carried that faint metallic tang. I was the cold spot that lingered near his desk, pushing him, guiding him. He found it by accident. His search had moved from the land to the name. Ashford. It was an old name, not common. He was looking for property records, business licenses. But in a digitized archive of a small, defunct local newspaper, he found a brief society notice from over a century ago. It mentioned a rising portraitist, a man celebrated for his preternaturally lifelike work. The article was short, but it included the artist's name and patron. Jeremiah Ashford, it said, had just completed his most celebrated piece, a self-portrait commissioned by the industrialist Charles Wentworth. Mark's breath caught. He knew that name. Charles Wentworth was a local legend, a robber baron whose name still adorned a library and a concert hall in the city. He opened a new tab, searching for Charles Wentworth Portrait Ashford. The results were few. Wentworth had been a reclusive man, but in the university's digital art collection, Mark found a single, low-resolution photograph. It was a painting of a severe man in a high-collared coat, and in the bottom corner, clear even in the grainy image, was the signature. J. Ashford, 1889. He leaned closer to the screen, his heart hammering. It wasn't the subject that held his attention. It was the artist's signature. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, and utterly identical to the signature he had seen on the donation plaque at the new playground. The same hand that had painted a tycoon over a century ago was now signing community improvement checks. The practical world, Mark's world of spreadsheets and logic, shattered. He looked from the screen to the window, to the dark, quiet street where the handsome, ageless man sometimes walked. The pieces, impossible and terrifying, clicked into place. He wasn't dealing with a suspicious neighbor. He was dealing with something that had been old when his great-grandfather was a boy. Something that had painted away its own soul over a century ago and was now circling his daughter. He closed the laptop. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was charged, thick with the truth. He finally understood the nature of the cold draft, the bad dreams, the taste of copper. He finally understood what he was fighting for. It was no longer just about safety. It was about salvation. And his unlikely ally was the very dust he was always wiping from the shelves. He did not tell Sarah what he had found. The words would not form. They were too absurd, too terrifying. Instead, he began to act. He bought more cameras, tiny ones, and placed them inside, pointing at the doors and windows. He bought a new lock for Chloe's door, a heavy brass deadbolt. He started reading her different bedtime stories, tales of clever children who outwitted witches and tricked giants. He was arming her in the only way he knew how. I felt his resolve like a new foundation laid beneath the house. My own influence, once a thing of subtle suggestions, found a conduit in his newfound purpose. When he sanded the bottom of Chloe's door so it would close more tightly, the sawdust swirled in a pattern only she could see, the shape of a key. When he tested the new lock, the sharp, solid click echoed with a finality that felt like a shield snapping into place. Chloe, for her part, stopped drawing the two men. She started drawing the house. She drew it with fierce, protective lines, a fortress with a shining golden key hovering above it. She drew her father standing at the door, tall and strong, holding a hammer that glowed with a soft, blue light. She was internalizing the new reality, translating our silent war into a language of crayons and construction paper. The thing that wore my name did not retreat. It changed its tactics. The harassment from the homeowners association ceased. Instead, a new family moved into the house directly across the street. They were a perfectly ordinary-looking couple with a son about Chloe's age. They were always gardening, or washing their car, or sitting on their porch. They waved at Mark with friendly, vacant smiles. They were too perfect, too present. I could feel the wrongness emanating from them, a static hum of emptiness. They were his new eyes, his sentinels. The battle lines were now drawn in the open. A cold war fought across a suburban street. Mark would watch the neighbors, and they would watch him back, their smiles never fading. I would gather the dust in their house and send it skittering across their polished floors in unsettling patterns. The air in their home would grow cold, and they would simply put on sweaters, their movements smooth and unnervingly synchronized. The final provocation came on a Tuesday. Mark was leaving for work when he saw the neighbor boy standing on the sidewalk, holding a small wooden toy boat. He was staring at Chloe's window. As Mark approached his car, the boy turned his head, his eyes too old for his face. "My dad says you have a ghost," the boy said, his voice flat. "He says it's a sad old thing. He says we shouldn't be afraid of dust." Mark froze, his hand on the car door handle. The words were a direct challenge, a message delivered by a child just as ours were. He looked from the boy to the house, where the father was now standing in the doorway, smiling his bland, empty smile. That evening, Mark went into the attic for the first time. He was looking for old boxes, for anything that might tell him more about the property, about the earth it was built upon. He found nothing but insulation and forgotten Christmas decorations. But as he turned to leave, his flashlight beam caught something in the far corner, tucked under the eaves. It was a small wooden box, warped with age and covered in a thick layer of the very dust I was made of. It had not been there before. I had pulled it from the memory of the house, a fragment of my own past, made manifest by our shared need. He brought it downstairs. The box was locked, but the lock was rusted and fragile. He broke it with a screwdriver. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single tarnished silver brush, the kind used for mixing paints. Wrapped around its handle was a brittle, yellowed scrap of paper. On it, in my own frantic, desperate handwriting, were the words I had scribbled the night I truly understood what I had done, the night I realized there was no going back. It does not capture the soul. It transfers it. The canvas is a door. Mark held the paper in his trembling hand. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room. not in fear but in desperate, searching hope. He finally spoke, his voice a raw whisper into the quiet house. "Are you here?" The air grew still. The hum of the refrigerator faded away. I had no voice to answer, but I made the dust on the table beside him stir. I gathered it into a single, swirling column that held its shape for a full 3 seconds before collapsing back into nothing. He saw it. He let out a long, shaky breath and nodded. The alliance was now acknowledged. The ghost and the father. We were ready. Story 2. The house remained unchanged, and somehow that unchanging quality felt like a cruelty all its own. The dining room wallpaper, that gentle yellow Dora had selected 3 springs back, still captured the afternoon sunlight in exactly the same way it always had. The crack in the kitchen window, the one they'd planned to repair, remained. Even the fragrance persisted, her lavender pouches hidden in drawers, gradually releasing their scent into rooms that no longer contained anyone who valued such details. Harold Marsh navigated these spaces like a man submerged, each movement demanding more energy than it should. At 46, he transformed into someone people observed with deliberately neutral expressions in just 8 weeks. The husbands of Dora's friends delivered casseroles he couldn't recall consuming. His co-workers at the insurance firm addressed him with that measured, cautious compassion reserved for the mourning or the mentally diminished. Everyone accepted that Dora had passed peacefully. The death certificate listed cardiac arrest. She'd retired for the night complaining of exhaustion and simply hadn't awakened. A mercy, people assured him. At least there'd been no suffering. Harold concurred because that was expected. He concurred, and he received their sympathies. And he existed alone in the house, where everything stayed the same, except for the single alteration that rendered everything else hollow. It was 6 days following the funeral when he initially heard it. He'd been positioned at the kitchen sink, observing water cascade over a coffee mug he'd forgotten he was gripping, when the sound emerged from somewhere behind him. Not entirely a voice, not entirely a word. Something that inhabited the territory between awareness and cognition. A murmur so faint it could have been the house adjusting, or air traveling through aging pipes. Harold shut off the water and concentrated. Nothing. He dried the mug systematically, deliberately, and returned it to the cabinet. His hands, he observed, were trembling faintly. Not sufficiently that others would detect it, but enough that he registered it in his fingers. A quiver that appeared to originate from somewhere beyond muscle. The second occurrence eliminated all uncertainty. It transpired just past midnight. He'd been resting in bed, their bed, though he couldn't conceptualize it that way yet, staring at the ceiling and numbering his breaths as the grief therapist had recommended. 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhale and exhale, as though controlled breathing could somehow mend what was fractured. The murmur originated from the room's corner, beside the closet where Dora's garments still hung in their orderly, color-arranged rows. Harold jerked upright so rapidly his vision blurred. His heart, that faithless organ, pounded against his ribs. Dora? The sound of his own voice in the darkened house alarmed him more than the murmur had. It appeared to belong to another person. Someone whose wife genuinely had died of cardiac arrest. Someone who possessed the right to utter her name with that specific combination of yearning and anguish. He rose from bed and activated every light in the room. Then he proceeded through the house, illuminating the remainder. When finished, the house radiated like a vessel on dark waters, every window luminous, every shadow eliminated. He positioned himself on the living room sofa and awaited daybreak, and the murmur didn't return. By the 3rd week, he'd grown to anticipate it. The murmur arrived at irregular intervals, occasionally twice daily, occasionally absent for days, but invariably when he was solitary, and never when he expected it. He detected it while shaving, while organizing mail, while queuing at the grocery store where he and Dora had purchased supplies weekly for 11 years. He started to comprehend that the murmur was a word. The identical word echoed repeatedly, though he couldn't distinguish what it was. It possessed syllables, 2, he believed, perhaps 3, and it conveyed an urgency that constricted his stomach. Dora's voice, or something resembling her voice, stripped of everything save this single, indecipherable communication. Harold grew fixated on hearing it distinctly. He concluded his bereavement absence and returned to the insurance office, but discovered he couldn't focus on claim documents and policy updates that had previously provided his days their reassuring framework. Instead, he sat at his workspace replaying the sound mentally, attempting to separate it from the ambient static of memory and mourning. Was it a name? A location? An indictment? His co-workers noticed, naturally. Beverly from accounting, who delivered him a tuna casserole the week following Dora's passing, started observing him with an expression hovering between worry and distress. She approached his desk with needless inquiries about expense documentation, her eyes examining his face as if searching for indicators of approaching breakdown. One afternoon, she delivered coffee he hadn't requested, positioned it beside a pile of unprocessed claims, and inquired, "Harold, are you getting sleep?" "Some," he responded, which was accurate in the most literal sense. "You appear like you haven't been." "I'm coping, Beverly." She remained a moment longer, and Harold detected she wished to articulate more. Something regarding grief or duration or recovery. Instead, she momentarily touched his shoulder, a gesture so unanticipated it made him recoil, and then she returned to her workspace. That evening, his manager, Dale Pritchard, summoned him to his office. Dale was a man of remarkable averageness who'd labored at Midwest Mutual for 33 years without complication. He positioned his substantial frame into his desk chair and indicated for Harold to sit. "Harold," Dale initiated, "we're all concerned about you." "I'm coping," Harold echoed, employing the identical words he'd offered Beverly. "You don't appear like you're coping. You appear like you're—" Dale hesitated, pursuing the appropriate words. "Like you're elsewhere." Harold acknowledged because it appeared appropriate. In reality, he was elsewhere. He was in the location where Dora's voice contacted him with a word he couldn't comprehend, and nothing else held significance. "I believe you should accept additional time," Dale stated. It wasn't entirely a proposal. "Another month, 2 months, whatever duration you require. Your role will be here when you're prepared." Harold examined Dale's face, the authentic concern visible there, and experienced a blend of appreciation and disgust. These people intended well. They wished to assist, but they were mistaken about what they believed they were witnessing, providing solace for a grief that wasn't precisely what they envisioned it to be. "All right," Harold stated. The following day, he emptied his desk, a procedure that consumed less duration than he'd anticipated for 14 years of labor. Beverly observed him depart from her cubicle window, her face compressed against the glass like a child's, and Harold elevated his hand in a motion that could have been farewell or something altogether different. At home, Harold initiated his investigation. He commenced with the internet, that enormous archive of human understanding and absurdity. Deep into the night, he positioned himself at Dora's computer. She'd utilized it for online banking and recipe queries, and entered phrases into search engines. Hearing deceased loved ones, grief-induced hallucinations, auditory manifestations of bereavement. The findings were simultaneously reassuring and pointless. Psychology articles clarified that auditory hallucinations were prevalent among the recently bereaved. The mind, frantic for connection, fabricated what it required. Forum exchanges were saturated with people recounting comparable experiences. A mother's laughter in a vacant house, a husband's footfalls on the stairs, a child's voice summoning from another room. But none of them portrayed what Harold was experiencing. Their narratives were about consolation, about sensing proximity to the departed. The voices they detected spoke words of affection or comfort. They discovered these episodes significant, even lovely in their melancholy. Dora's voice provided nothing of that nature. There was no consolation in it, no gentleness, just the persistent repetition of one incomprehensible word, delivered with a mechanical persistence that unsettled him. He pivoted to spiritualism. The first medium was a middle-aged woman who functioned from a converted garage in North Liberty. She ignited sage and requested him to grasp a polished stone while she closed her eyes and hummed quietly. Nothing transpired. The second operated from a storefront in Iowa City and employed tarot cards arranged on velvet fabric. She informed him Dora was tranquil and wished him to understand she'd forgiven him. Harold departed without compensating, and the woman called after him about karmic obligations. The third medium was distinct. Walt Gunderson resided in a humble house near the university, the type retired academics relocate to when they desire peaceful obscurity. He was approximately 70, lean in the manner men who've abandoned interest in food tend to be, with uncut gray hair and garments that appeared slept in. "I don't conduct readings anymore," he stated when Harold telephoned. "Haven't for years. I'll compensate whatever you request. It's not regarding money, Mr. Marsh." A lengthy silence. I discontinued because most people don't genuinely wish to hear what their deceased have to communicate. "I do," Harold stated. Another silence. Then, "Come tomorrow at 2. And Walt's living room was crammed with books, covering every wall, accumulated on tables, heaped in corners. The furniture possessed the worn, comfortable appearance of objects utilized for many decades. Walt directed Harold to position himself across from him, studying him with eyes that appeared to perceive more than Harold wished to expose. "Tell me," Walt prompted. Harold conveyed everything. The murmur, the single incomprehensible word, its occurrence at arbitrary moments, invariably when solitary, invariably in Dora's voice. Walt listened without interrupting. When Harold concluded, the elderly man reclined, silent for so extended Harold questioned if he'd fallen asleep. Then he leaned forward again. "Your wife," Walt inquired. "How did she pass?" "Cardiac arrest. In her sleep. Unanticipated." "Yes. She retired for the night and never awakened." Walt observed him for an extended moment, and Harold experienced the uncomfortable sensation that he was being evaluated against some invisible criteria. "I have something to convey to you, Mr. Marsh, and you won't appreciate it." Walt's voice was gentle but resolute. "Sometimes the haunting possesses nothing to do with the deceased whatsoever. Sometimes it's regarding the living and what they decline to confront. The sounds we detect don't invariably originate from external sources. Sometimes they originate from somewhere much nearer." "You believe I'm fabricating this?" "No. I believe you're detecting precisely what you claim you're detecting. But I'm stating the difficulty isn't what your wife is attempting to convey to you. The difficulty is what you're attempting to convey to yourself." Harold rose. "Thank you for your time, mister." But Harold was already at the entrance, already departing. Walt's words pursued him out into sunlight that appeared too intense, too mundane for what he'd just been conveyed. That night, the murmur arrived 3 times. Once as he prepared dinner, once while he bathed, Dora's voice penetrating through the water's noise with absolute clarity. Once at 2 in the morning, rousing him so abruptly, he knocked the lamp from the nightstand. Harold positioned himself in the darkness and comprehended that Walt had been mistaken. This wasn't regarding what he couldn't confront. This was regarding Dora, regarding whatever communication she was attempting to deliver. The difficulty was simply that he couldn't hear it with sufficient clarity. Technology. If mediums and spiritualists couldn't assist him, perhaps science could. He initiated modestly, with a digital voice recorder of the variety students employ for lectures. He positioned it on the nightstand and allowed it to operate all night, anticipating capturing the murmur when it arrived. In the morning, he examined 8 hours of ambient house sounds, the furnace cycling on, the refrigerator humming, his own breathing and sleep movements. and nothing additional. Yet, the murmur had arrived that night. He detected it himself, which indicated the difficulty was with the equipment, not with the phenomenon itself. Harold purchased superior gear, professional-grade microphones and noise reduction recording software. He converted Dora's craft room, where she'd quilted on Sundays, her hands moving with the instinctive precision born of routine, into a makeshift sound studio. He ran cables along the walls, mounted the microphone on its stand, and organized everything with meticulous precision. His sister Carol telephoned from Des Moines, her voice tense with anxiety. "Harold, people are concerned about you." "What people?" "Everyone. Dale contacted me. He stated you've abandoned your employment, and your neighbor, Mrs. Henshaw, claims you haven't departed the house in weeks." "I've been occupied." "Occupied with what?" "Harold, you need to care for yourself. You need to..." "Oh, I need to resolve this," Harold stated, surprising himself with the intensity in his voice. "That's what I require now. Not casseroles or grief therapy. I need to comprehend what she's attempting to convey to me." The silence on the line persisted so extensively Harold believed Carol had disconnected. "Then, who's attempting to convey to you what?" "Never mind." "Harold, are you detecting things?" "I have to disconnect now." He terminated the call and unplugged the landline phone. When his cell rang, Carol again, or Dale, or others whose concern felt invasive, he allowed it to proceed to voicemail, then eliminated the messages unheard. Until mid-November, delivered progress. One Tuesday afternoon, as external light diminished to the dull gray that announces winter's arrival, he was working on the previous evening's recording. It appeared sharper than earlier attempts, more defined. Employing software he'd mastered over recent months, he isolated, amplified, and refined the audio until he finally detected it. Not the complete word, but the beginning. A vowel emerging from the depths, followed by a consonant cluster. The word acquiring form, except there was no interference, no underlying awareness. The recording was pristine, too pristine. Only ambient house sounds, filtered and disregarded, pursuing deeper significance absent from the data itself, inherent in the listening procedure. He preserved the file, secured multiple copies, replayed for verification. 2, possibly 3 syllables. The first perhaps the second unclear, yet perceptible. Compelling. Understanding arrived laboriously. Overnight, oblivious to time's passage, house chilling, furnace off, forgotten to reactivate. His coffee cooled, developed a film on its surface, was eventually abandoned. Outside the window, daylight arrived and departed and arrived again, marking intervals that had forfeited all significance. By the second dawn he had it isolated, the murmur refined of all other sound, existing in absolute clarity on his screen. He'd amplified it, refined it, enhanced it until Dora's voice, unmistakably hers, with that slight morning hoarseness she possessed before her first cup of coffee, articulated the word with perfect precision. Harold pressed play. The word struck the speakers with terrible accuracy. Asphyxiate. Harold sat motionless. The computer hummed quietly. A car passed outside, its tires grinding on the gravel road. Somewhere in the house, the furnace activated and warm air commenced circulating through the ducts. Asphyxiate. Dora's voice, no longer a murmur, but something colder, more conclusive. A word articulated with the detached precision of a death certificate, drained of emotion, drained of everything, except its bare, factual significance. The variety of word Harold handled daily at the insurance company. Cause of death. Mechanism of injury. Terminology that converted human suffering into manageable data. Not I can't breathe. Not help me. Not any words a dying person might actually contemplate or attempt to scream. But a clinical designation, a diagnosis. The precise medical terminology for what was transpiring inside her body. But Dora had never articulated in such terminology. She taught elementary school. She appreciated mystery novels and solved crosswords and articulated things like "I'm stuffed after dinner." Not, "I'm experiencing postprandial distension." This wasn't her word. It was his. And with that realization, the memory didn't arrive slowly. There was no gentle surfacing from suppression, no gradual assembly of fragments. It arrived all at once, whole and perfect and devastating, like a wall collapsing to expose what had always been behind it. The argument had been regarding something insignificant, his mother's upcoming visit, he believed. Or perhaps it had commenced earlier, at dinner, over some remark about the grocery bill. The specifics were fragments now, except for one thing. Dora's voice edged with that particular contempt born from 11 years of accumulated disappointments. "You're identical to your father, weak, and you don't even realize it." The words had struck something inside him. Not anger initially, something colder. A fracture that allowed reality to seep through. That she was correct. That he'd always recognized it. That his entire existence had been constructed around avoiding this very recognition. He'd been positioned at the bedroom entrance. Dora was already beneath the covers, her reading glasses balanced on her nose. A crossword book open on her lap. She glanced up at him with an expression combining irritation and something resembling pity, and Harold had crossed the room. How many steps? 4? Ulinda. 5? And retrieved her pillow. She'd resisted. Naturally, she'd resisted. Her hands had scratched at his arms and face. Her legs had thrashed, entangled in the bedding. The crossword book had tumbled to the floor, its pages spread open. Her reading glasses had flown off, landing somewhere beneath the bed. But Harold was stronger, and the terrible calm that had settled over him rendered him methodical and efficient. He'd pressed down and maintained pressing until Dora's movements grew weaker, more frantic, and then ceased entirely. Afterward, he'd positioned himself on the bed's edge for what could have been hours or moments, time having forfeited its normal structure, attempting to comprehend what he'd accomplished. The woman resting beside him, her face already acquiring death's smooth pallor, was Dora, his wife, the person he'd vowed to cherish and protect. Yet he'd eliminated her because she'd articulated something probably accurate. He contacted the police. They arrived quickly, 2 officers who appeared young enough to still be in high school, and they were compassionate. They examined the bedroom, neat and undisturbed, except for a pillow on the floor. They observed Dora, peaceful as though sleeping. They observed Harold, devastated, clearly in shock, still in his work garments because he'd arrived home late, and she was already in bed when they'd argued. The senior officer posed questions. When had Harold last observed her alive? Had she mentioned any pains or discomfort? Any history of cardiac problems? Harold responded mechanically, his voice originating from somewhere outside himself. Each response accurate as far as anyone could verify. The medical examiner arrived, middle-aged, businesslike, weary in the manner of those accustomed to death. He examined Dora there in the bedroom, her face peaceful, no indicators of distress. The pillow that had somehow concluded on the floor. Just another detail in a room where a woman had retired to sleep and never stirred again. He inquired about Dora's health history. Had she been stressed? Any family history of cardiac problems? Harold mentioned, and this was accurate, that her mother had died of a heart attack at 53. The medical examiner acknowledged, making notes on his pad. Cardiac arrest, he stated. It can transpire suddenly. For women her age, stress, underlying conditions, hereditary factors all contribute. With no indicators of trauma or reason for suspicion, there's no necessity for an autopsy. A terrible thing, certainly, but not uncommon. And Harold, positioned in the kitchen as strangers navigated through his house, removing his wife, sensed the memory beginning to diminish even as it was being formed. His mind, that deceitful instrument, was already reshaping the narrative, constructing a version he could exist with. She'd stated she was exhausted. She'd retired to bed. She hadn't awakened. By the conclusion of the funeral service, he accepted it. The argument, had there been one? He couldn't quite recall. Had diminished to the quality of a half-remembered dream. The pillow in his hands. Dora's face going slack. The terrible silence when her body ceased resisting. Everything had been filed away somewhere his conscious mind couldn't access. But Dora recalled. Harold stared at the computer screen, at the waveform of his deceased wife's voice, articulating the word that portrayed her death. Only it wasn't her voice whatsoever, was it? It was his. It had always been his. The murmur, the word, the entire haunting, all generated by his own mind, replaying the one truth he couldn't permit himself to forget, even as he attempted desperately to suppress it. Not a communication, not an attempt to contact him from beyond. Just guilt, manifesting in the only manner it could penetrate his carefully constructed denial, by disguising itself as something external, something he could examine, interpret, resolve. Anything but acknowledge as originating from within himself. The recordings had captured nothing. The software had discovered nothing. What he detected during those endless listening sessions was the sound of his own psychological defenses, finally disintegrating under sustained scrutiny. He'd required it to be Dora's voice, because that rendered it an outside difficulty, something he could eventually resolve. A supernatural disturbance he could terminate by deciphering its communication. But there was no communication, only the truth. The simple, undeniable fact of what he'd accomplished. Asphyxiate, his word, from his vocabulary. His mind's method of compelling him to confront the truth in the only language he could comprehend. Impersonal, precise, undeniable. Harold rose, his legs sensing weak and unsteady as though he'd been positioned for days rather than hours. He navigated through the house, past Dora's craft room with its sewing supplies still organized in neat rows, past the kitchen where her cookbook remained on its shelf, past the living room where she'd solved crosswords on Sunday nights. In their bedroom he paused, observing the bed where it had transpired. Someone, probably Carol during one of her worried visits, had altered the sheets. But it was the identical bed where Dora had died while Harold's hands compressed a pillow over her face and maintained it there until she ceased moving. He contemplated what would transpire if he proceeded to the police now. If he entered the station and confessed what he'd accomplished. They would request evidence. He would possess none. Dora's body was cremated, her ashes scattered in her favorite garden. The bedroom was cleaned, the bedding altered, any physical trace long erased by time and domestic routines. And what evidence did he possess? A recording capturing only ambient house sounds. Audio files displaying no trace of any voice except the one in his own mind. They would be compassionate. They would observe a man in collapse, grief manifesting as auditory hallucinations and false memories. They would direct him to resources. They would observe him as someone requiring medication and counseling, not as a murderer. Because that's what he was, not someone whose wife had died of sudden cardiac arrest, but someone who'd eliminated her in a rage so intense it had erased his own memory of the act. Harold returned to Dora's craft room. The computer was still activated, her voice's waveform motionless on the screen. He stared at this visual representation of his wife's final conscious thought for an extended time before deleting it. The file moved to trash, which he emptied. Then he accessed backup directories, removing those copies too. Then he deleted the audio software, reformatted the hard drive, and transported the computer downstairs along with all the recording equipment he'd accumulated over recent months. Upon returning upstairs, silence saturated the house, unlike any since Dora's death. The absence of the murmur sensed like a presence itself, a quiet so complete it compressed on his ears. Harold Marsh positioned himself at the dining table, hands folded before him. The November afternoon outside was transitioning to dusk. Soon darkness would descend. Then dawn would arrive, and a new day would commence, and another after that. Each one transporting him further from the moment he'd taken his wife's life, and then persuaded himself he hadn't. The murmur was gone, but the recognition remained, and Harold comprehended that this was the genuine ghost. Not Dora's voice articulating a word she'd never actually articulated. She'd been beyond speech in her final moments, her mind only forming the word internally in its last instance, but his own consciousness compelling him to observe what he'd accomplished, forcing him to uncover the truth he'd so carefully concealed. He positioned himself in the silent house and comprehended that this was his existence now. This was what he'd brought upon himself. The endless days ahead, where he would transport the weight of what he'd accomplished, unable to confess it, unable to erase it, able only to continue existing in the house where Dora had died. Winter was approaching. The days would grow shorter. The nights would extend longer, and Harold Marsh would position himself in his silent house, listening to the quiet that had once contained his wife's voice. Story 3. The first thing Malcolm learned upon waking was that the world had become a room of shifting proportions. The ceiling, a blank expanse of acoustic tile and fluorescent lights, would sometimes press down like a great pale palm, and other times recede into a starless, infinite sky. The walls breathed, their beige surfaces swelling and contracting in a slow, tidal rhythm that had nothing to do with his own shallow breaths. The door to the hallway was a squat, malevolent eye some days, a yawning, beckoning chasm the next. He had been asleep for a long time, a fact he knew not from memory, but from the dry, stale taste of the air, and the profound weakness that held him to the bed like chains. A man named Christopher, whose face was a familiar landscape of worry and love, was often there, holding his hand, and it was through that touch that the second thing came to him. It was not a memory, not a thought. It was a knowledge, blooming in his mind like a dark flower. He saw Christopher as a boy of 7, kneeling in a sun-drenched garden, the smell of turned earth and tomato vines thick in the air, weeping over a dead cat, its fur matted, its small body still warm. He felt the gritty soil under the boy's knees, the hot, shameful tears, the crushing weight of a first, true loss. Malcolm's own eyes welled up. He tried to speak, to form the name of the cat, Mittens, but his throat was a rusted gate. Christopher only squeezed his hand tighter, mistaking the tears for a reaction to his own presence. "It's okay, Mal. You're back. You're here." He was not back. He was somewhere else entirely. The doctors called it a side effect of the traumatic brain injury, a synaptic misfire, a phantom limb of the mind. They shone lights in his eyes and asked him to track their fingers, their white coats crisp and smelling of antiseptic. When the young neurologist, Dr. Evans, took his wrist to check his pulse, Malcolm was suddenly drowning. He was in a crowded bar, the bass thumping in his chest, the air thick with perfume and sweat. He was leaning in to kiss a woman with fiery red hair, her name a whisper in his mind. Chloe. The taste of her lip gloss was sweet, like artificial cherries. He felt the doctor's own guilt, a sharp, metallic tang, and the image of a wedding band being tucked into a pocket. Malcolm pulled his hand away as if burned. The doctor's professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second. a crack in the clinical facade. They sent him home with Christopher, to the house that should have been a sanctuary. But the shifting proportions had followed him. The hallway to his old bedroom stretched into a tunnel that seemed to take minutes to traverse. The doorframe to the kitchen sometimes felt like it was squeezing him as he passed through. And the objects, the simple, mundane artifacts of his former life, were the worst. He picked up a paperback from his nightstand, a forgotten thriller, and the moment his fingers brushed the worn cover, he was not reading the words. He was the book. He felt the pressure of the printing press, the chemical smell of fresh ink, the hands of a tired woman in a distribution center, the anxious excitement of a teenage boy buying it with his allowance, the long years of dust and silence on the shelf. It was a torrent, a screaming chorus of histories. He dropped the book with a gasp. He learned to shield himself, to wear gloves, to avoid contact. He existed in a bubble of careful isolation, even as he lived in the house with his father. Christopher was his anchor, a steady, patient presence who cooked his favorite meals and tried to fill the silence with stories from the years Malcolm had lost. He never spoke of Erin. And Malcolm, whose own memories of her were a beautiful, painful blur, did not ask. He saw the shadow of her in his father's eyes, a shared, unspoken grief. It was the television that broke the fragile peace. One evening, a political rally was broadcast, a sea of faces under the glare of stadium lights. A man was at the podium, his voice a calibrated instrument of warmth and authority. His name was Asa Edison. The camera zoomed in on his face, on his earnest smile, on his hand reaching out to the crowd. And as that hand filled the screen, Malcolm felt a jolt, a psychic shock that had nothing to do with physical touch. It was as if the man's image was a conduit for something vast and terrible. He stumbled into the set, his gloved hand pressing against the cool glass of the screen. The vision did not come as a narrative. It was a sensory avalanche. The smell of cold iron and wet stone. The taste of copper and ashes. A profound, absolute silence. The kind that exists only in vacuums and graves. And then, a flicker of motion, a thing of angles and shadows that was not a thing at all, but an absence, a hole torn in the fabric of everything, and it was spreading. It was not a future of fire and bombs, of conventional catastrophe. It was an end of meaning, a great silencing, a world reduced to a static hum under a dead sky, with Asa Edison not as its destroyer, but as its quiet, smiling center. The vision passed, leaving Malcolm on his knees, vomiting onto the carpet, the cheerful applause from the television, a grotesque mockery. He tried to tell Christopher. The words came out in a choked, broken flood. The shifting room, the visions, the terrible emptiness he had seen in Edison's future. He saw the doubt in his father's eyes, a deep, paternal fear, not of Edison, but for his son's fractured mind. Mal, you've been through so much. This is a lot to process. These are dreams, nightmares. It's not a nightmare, Malcolm whispered, his voice raw. It's a premonition. He's a door, and he's about to open. He had to make someone believe him. He went to the authorities, to a local FBI field office, a building of such stark, bureaucratic normalcy that its proportions felt insultingly fixed. The agent who met with him, a man named Hiller, with a tired face and a cheap suit, listened with an air of professional patience that was thinner than paper. Malcolm, desperate, made a mistake. He reached across the table, his bare fingers brushing the agent's wrist. He did not see Edison. He saw Hiller's daughter, a girl of 10 with braces, lying in a hospital bed, her skin pale and translucent. He felt the agent's powerlessness, a cold stone in his gut, the smell of sterilized sheets and wilting flowers, the beep of a heart monitor that was a countdown to a loss that would define him. Malcolm recoiled, his face ashen. Your daughter, Sarah Dung. The illness is in remission. She's going to be okay. The agent's face went from bored to dangerously still. The air in the room tightened. Get out, he said, his voice low and venomous. Get out before I have you committed. Defeated and terrified, Malcolm did the only thing he could think of. He found Erin. She lived in a small apartment on the other side of the city, the scent of turpentine and linseed oil replacing the floral perfume he remembered. She was a painter now. She opened the door, and her face, older, wiser, more beautiful in its sorrow, was a physical blow. The years of his absence were a chasm between them. He stood on her welcome mat, a frayed piece of core, and begged her to listen. She let him in. Her home was a gallery of a life lived without him. Canvases leaned against the walls, landscapes of places he had never seen, portraits of people he did not know. He told her everything. The coma, the shifting world, the terrible gift, the vision of Asa Edison, and the void that followed him. He did not touch her. He kept his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his coat. She listened, her artist's eyes seeing more than just his words. She saw the terror that had worn grooves into his face. She saw the profound, unshakable certainty. When he finished, the silence in the room was heavy. The only sound was the drip of a tap in the kitchen. I believe you, she said, and the simplicity of it broke him. He began to cry, silent, helpless sobs that shook his whole body. She did not come to him, did not offer a comforting touch. She understood now, the danger of it. She simply stood, a witness to his ruin. What can I do? She asked. I have to stop him, Malcolm said. I have to get close. I have to touch him. I have to know for sure. The opportunity came weeks later. A fundraiser. A black-tie gala at the city's art museum, where Edison would be shaking hands, pressing the flesh, building his momentum. Erin, with her connections in the arts community, got them an invitation. Christopher, his face etched with a dread he could no longer conceal, helped Malcolm get ready, tying his bow tie with trembling fingers. This is a mistake, son. Please. I have to, Dad, Malcolm said, his voice quiet. It's the only thing I can do. The museum was a nightmare of shifting geometry. The grand marble staircase seemed to stretch upward for a mile. The vaulted ceilings of the main hall were the domes of some colossal, alien cathedral. The crowd was a sea of potential visions, a cacophony of hidden pasts and secret futures. He moved through them like a ghost, Erin a steady, silent presence at his sidra provama continua, her hand a hair's breadth from his elbow, a guide without contact. And then he saw him. Asa Edison. He was holding court near a massive abstract sculpture, his laughter too loud, his smile too wide. He was a man, just a man. And yet the air around him seemed thinner, colder. Malcolm felt the pull of him, the psychic gravity of the void he carried. He began to move, a salmon pushing upstream against the current of the crowd. His heart was a frantic bird beating against his ribs. The room seemed to narrow, the sounds muffling into a dull roar. He saw Agent Hiller across the room, talking to a city official, his eyes scanning the crowd and locking onto Malcolm with cold recognition. It was too late to turn back. He was steps away. Edison turned, his gaze falling on Malcolm. The eyes were the worst part. They were not the eyes of a monster. They were calm, friendly, empty. They were the eyes of the thing in the vision, the quiet center of the storm. Mr. Edison, Malcolm said, his voice a dry rasp. A pleasure. He thrust out his hand. Edison, a politician to his core, took it. The world did not just fall away. It was unmade. There was no past. There was no future. There was only the hum. A low, pervasive, vibrational hum that was not a sound, but a condition of existence. It was the hum of static on a dead channel, the hum of a billion insects in a lightless hive, the hum of a universe winding down to its final entropic state. Malcolm was floating or falling in a space that had no direction. There were no images of war, no screams, no fire. There was only the relentless, peaceful, annihilating hum. And he knew, with a certainty that was itself a form of madness, that this was not a possible future. This was an inevitability. Edison was not a man who would cause this. He was a man who was already a part of it, a focal point, a catalyst. He was the key turning in the lock of reality. The handshake lasted 3 seconds. When Edison released his grip, Malcolm was back in the museum, the cacophony of the gala crashing in on him like a physical wave. He stumbled, his legs giving way. Erin was there, catching him, her touch a brand that seared him with a flash of her own bright, painful, beautiful life. A memory of their first kiss, the smell of rain on pavement, the crushing loneliness of his empty hospital bed. The contrast was unbearable. Edison was already turning away, his smile never wavering, moving on to the next hand, the next vote, the next step toward the great, silent hum. They took him home. Christopher put him to bed as if he were a child again. He did not speak. He could not. The hum was still there, a permanent layer beneath the surface of the world, a ringing in the soul. He had looked into the heart of the coming nothing, and it had looked back. The authorities came the next day. Hiller was with them, his expression grimly satisfied. They asked him questions about his intentions, about his stability. They called it a psychotic episode, a public disturbance. Christopher and Erin defended him, their voices tight with fear and defiance. But the men in their official clothes only saw a broken man and his enabling, misguided family. Malcolm said nothing. He just sat in his chair by the window, watching the world outside. The leaves on the oak tree in the yard were turning. A neighbor's dog barked. A car drove past. A perfectly normal day, ticking away its seconds toward an end it could not comprehend. He was not a hero. He was a witness. He knew he could not stop what was coming. The revelation was not that he had to fight it, but that he had to live with the knowledge of it. The burden was not the gift. The burden was the truth. Weeks bled into months. The investigations faded. Edison's star continued to rise. Malcolm learned to function within the hum. He and Erin found a way to be together. A careful, quiet love built on looks and words and a profound, shared understanding of the abyss. They never touched, their love a beautiful, haunted sculpture behind glass. One afternoon, deep in the winter, Malcolm was sitting in the living room with Christopher. A fire crackled in the hearth. The news was on, muted. On the screen, Asa Edison was taking the oath of office, his hand on a Bible. Malcolm did not need to see it. He could feel the shift, a subtle deepening of the hum, a new solidity to the silence that was gathering at the edges of everything. Christopher, sensing his son's unease, reached over and placed his hand on Malcolm's knee. It was a simple paternal gesture, one of comfort, of connection. The glove was off. The touch was bare, but no vision came. No memory of a dead cat, no secret guilt, no flash of a past or future. There was only the pressure of his father's hand, warm and real. And then, Malcolm saw it, on the back of his own hand, resting on the arm of the chair. A single, tiny, perfect snowflake landed on the pale skin. It was intricately laced, a marvel of geometry, a fleeting cold jewel. He watched it, mesmerized, as it did not melt. It simply sat there, a delicate, impossible weight. He looked out the window. The sky was a clear, hard blue. There was no snow. There'd been no snow for days. He looked back at his hand. The snowflake was gone. There was no wetness, no trace that it had ever been there. It was a symbol without a key, a message from a world that was already beginning to forget its own rules. A beautiful, silent, and indecipherable omen in the growing hum.